Welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationships between climate, nature, and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, and the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means for businesses in today's economy. Transition metals and critical minerals are key ingredients in some of the most important technologies in the green transition. They go into electric vehicles and renewable energy technologies in far greater quantities than their high-emitting counterparts. But the industry will face significant challenges over the coming decades to meet demand. As one scientist put it, critical minerals can be defined as the stuff you need but that you can't get. Overcoming the challenges to ramping up mineral supply is key to delivering the clean energy transition. Joining me to discuss these challenges are Beatriz Tanhanko and Diego Cacciapotti. Bea is a senior economist in our scenarios and modelling team focusing on climate change and model development. Thanks for joining us today, Bea.
Thanks, happy to be here.
We're also joined by Diego, who works in the commodities team where he covers the lithium and cobalt market, amongst others, and forecasts the battery and energy storage production sectors. Diego, it's great to have you on.
Thanks, Sarah. Pleasure to be here.
So, Diego, I'm actually going to start with you. I've bandied around a couple of terms, critical minerals and transition metals. Can you please define these terms as well as rare earths, which also come up?
Yeah, sure, Sarah. I think these are kind of umbrella terms that are often used interchangeably from people without realizing too much what they mean. So absolutely important to pin down the concepts here. Overall, I tend to agree with the definition that you gave before by that scientist. And I tend to think of those elements as elements that are essential to the functioning of our society. So for industries like the communication one, the aviation industry, to produce stuff like high-tech and electronic goods, to our energy functioning. And then given the current environmental juncture in which we are, people often refer to critical minerals, thinking of minerals, elements, and metals that are necessary and fundamental for the functioning of the energy industry. So everything that goes from the energy production to energy transmission and storage. As a matter of fact, there is a definition or a name that I like better, which is energy critical elements, which gives you a lot better the idea of why those metals and minerals are so important. And then there are rare earths, which is a more of a scientific term. It's defined by the periodic table, and they tend to be a subsample of critical minerals and transition metals. So they are equally important for very specific things like semiconductors or batteries, but they are just a subsample of critical minerals.
Thank you. That's very clear. And I really like your, what is it? Energy critical minerals.
Energy critical elements.
Elements. Yeah. Okay. That's very helpful. So, Bea, you've recently written a research brief about the risks associated with critical mineral supply. And it's something many people are talking about and thinking about. So why has it become such a hot topic at the moment?
Well, there are two things to consider, really. The first is that there's been like a general increase in awareness towards the need to transition to a low carbon economy. So people are becoming more aware of the dangers of climate change and that we have to do something about it. So this means renewable sources of energy will be replacing fossil fuels. Some drivers will be switching to electronic vehicles. Society will start becoming more electrified. And you're going to be needing critical minerals for this. So this requires a shift in the way the world works. And this will drive up demand for critical minerals. They'll form the building blocks of a greener economy. And the second thing to consider is that after the war between Ukraine and Russia, many of the different countries have become aware of their vulnerabilities and dependence on other countries. And this kind of import dependence has become concern. So many are seeing how reliant they are for these kinds of important resources, and they don't want to be exposed. So there's this mad scramble to secure supply chains. So there's just like new things to consider. it can get quite political. But for example, if certain countries have like a certain kind of dominance, like they don't want that. So it's really just a hot topic for everybody.
So it sounds like there's lots going on. It certainly seems to me like something that became more or came more to light during the pandemic when there were all those supply side crunches. But I first want to switch back to the demand. So Diego, you're in charge of forecasting prices and demand at Oxford Economics. So what does your demand forecast look like for critical metals?
Yeah, Sarah, critical minerals are a really fascinating market to be covering right now. Specifically for lithium and cobalt, most of the demand comes from the battery sector. So those are essential elements to electric vehicles, but not only to electric vehicles, to the overall energy storage or battery compound. And in 2022, really most of the demand came from batteries for lithium and cobalt. We're talking about 80% for lithium and 70% for cobalt. So those prices are increasingly driven by the amount of electric vehicles and of batteries that are produced around the world. It is kind of a given now that as the world transitions from a fossil fuel based society toward a clean and renewable energy based society, and as the amount of electric vehicles increases, the demand for lithium and cobalt will increase as well. So here at Oxford Economics, we forecast the electric vehicles penetration rate to increase a lot going forward. We're talking about from 13% last year toward more than 40% by 2030. So a massive increase, which will massively drive up demand for lithium and cobalt. So I would tend to say that really all the spotlight right now is on the role of electric vehicles in case of the demand for lithium and cobalt. But where it gets interesting is that not all electric vehicle batteries need the same amount of metals, right? So at the moment, most of the market is taken by lithium-ion batteries, which use, among other things, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and so on and so forth. But there is a rising competitor to lithium-ion batteries, and those are lithium iron phosphate batteries, which especially in China are growing a lot. They tend to be a lot cheaper than lithium-ion batteries. And the main difference with the lithium-ion batteries is that they do not need cobalt and nickel and manganese. They have a little bit of a lower driving range at the moment, lower performance than lithium-ion, but being much cheaper, they really represent an attractive alternative at the moment. And so we're questioning a lot the extent to which cobalt demand will rise as much as currently forecast, because there could be shifts in the type of batteries that manufacturers use to make electric vehicles, which might have massive implications for future demand of these minerals. While for lithium, the situation is a little bit more certain, given that in both type of batteries, the amount of lithium is kind of the same.
What's actually quite cool is that the definition of what is critical now can be different tomorrow. Because if you're going to be changing the composition of these batteries and then suddenly the next day you don't need cobalt anymore, then it's not going to be as critical anymore. So the definition of what's actually critical is quite dynamic.
That is really interesting. I never thought about it like that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Bay, I think you said something about in your research brief about different energy technologies, the role of different energy technologies.
Yeah, so it's beyond like electronic vehicles. Demand for these minerals will also depend on the technologies that we need for the green transition. So wind turbines, solar installations, all of these need different kinds of critical minerals. And these kinds of technologies are a bit more mineral intensive compared to the kind of traditional energy systems that we have now. So if we are going to be shifting towards these kinds of energy generating assets that require more minerals, then eventually we're also going to be needing more minerals.
Yeah, absolutely. And what does the supply side look like then?
So when it comes to mineral supply, this becomes a question of scarcity. It comes from the fear, are we going to run out? So After all, these minerals come from a very limited planet, and we know that our resources are quite scarce. So people are scared, how they used to be scared that they're going to run out of oil, they're going to run out of minerals. But when you take a closer look at what actually is scarce, geologically, these minerals are quite abundant. For example, rare earths are actually not that rare. What's rare is finding enough of these that makes mining them an economical option. So real scarcity actually happens when geopolitical and practical challenges exist. The minerals are there in the ground. It's just how do we get them out? So when you think about it, the real factors that affect scarcity is less geological, but actually more geopolitical.
So it's not about whether they exist, but about how to get them out of the ground, it sounds like. But I mean, where do they exist? What countries have these kind of metals and minerals?
Yeah, so where these minerals are is quite scattered. So lithium is mined in Australia, Argentina, and Chile. Nickel is mined mostly in Indonesia and the Philippines. Cobalt is mined in the DRC, and then rare earths are generally mined in China. So these concentrations are where they're mined, but there's also a certain type of concentration in terms of where it's processed. So a lot of the mineral processing actually happens in China. So even if they don't have a lot of the minerals themselves in terms of like the resources, a lot of them are mined there. So they do have that kind of control.
And does that give, China, but other countries that you mentioned as well, does that give them kind of a monopolistic power in these markets?
In the short term, you could say that because it takes a while to build the capacity to challenge this. So to build up the processing capacity would take a while. In terms of getting the permissions and getting some of the mines online, that might take years to happen. So it would be an effective monopoly in the short term until other countries can rise up to the challenge per se.
And that's a very good point, Ben. And I think even in cases and in instances where companies manage to get the necessary concessions to extract minerals out of the ground, it's not a given at all that they manage to do so. There's actually quite a specific example going on in Argentina, where I think around 38 companies are currently listed as having concession and projects to extract lithium. But if you dig deep into what's going on, there's only 3 who are actually going to operate, because most of these concessions turned out to either be in places where there's no lithium at all, or where it's not so concentrated to allow its extraction. So people are getting overexcited about lithium being the future of Argentina and always speaking about these 38 companies and projects, but turns out most of them are ghost projects.
That's really interesting. And actually something I wanted to pick up on, because there are so many projects and so many, as you said, these ghost projects who are quite speculative about their interests in these metals and minerals, but they are still getting into mining. And I think, I'm an environmental economist. We're all, here because we're interested in sustainability. And there's a tension between the need of the transition for these metals and minerals and the effect that they have on the environment through their mining. Bea, can you maybe speak to this trade-off?
Yeah, so mining critical minerals, you can say, has become kind of like the dirty little secret of the transition. It's going to be used in all of these technologies that will help us reduce our emissions, but at the same time, it's got such a destructive impact on the environment. So the development of mines, for example, would require infrastructure and the building of industrial commercial activities around them. So it would require deforestation, some shifts in the ecosystems that support this, and other kinds of degradation. And some mining activities, actually most of them, are also quite water and energy intensive, and they can contaminate the water resources and also increase emissions. So it's more like we just have to be careful not to trade off one climate problem with an environmental one because of how destructive it could be.
Thanks, Bea. So it sounds like there's a very real tension between protecting the world from climate change, as you said, and potentially damaging local ecosystems. The last thing I wanted to touch on and it's a big topic, but it's the local development opportunities from the commodities boom. You've mentioned lots of countries that have these resources. and I'm going to put the question to you both. How can those countries in Asia and Latin America and so on best leverage the transition metals that they have for their own development? Bea, perhaps starting with you.
It's a matter of using the revenues from developing these national mine reserves and using it to contribute positively to long-term economic development, creating new jobs and securing sustainable local opportunities. So countries can actually take the opportunity to build up the skills and processing capacity that they have and move up the value chain. So one example of this happening is in Indonesia, where they try to do this through industrial strategy, going as far as banning the exports of unprocessed nickel to encourage the production of domestic value-added products, because they hope that this would attract investments in smelters and processing plants in the country, and then this would make their exports more valuable. So that's one way to go about it.
Yeah, Bea, I think that's a great point, actually. I was reading the other day that Tesla is about to open up some battery manufacturing plants in Indonesia. So definitely working in that case. But perhaps in other instances, it can be a little bit of a short-sighted strategy from an economic perspective. Because if you think about it, going back to what I was talking about before with this shifting battery chemistry that is going on in the electric vehicles environment, a country like the DRC that is currently responsible of exporting most of cobalt around the world might suddenly run out of resources to leverage if the world decides and innovation agrees with it that we suddenly need other minerals. And then in other instances, such as in the lithium case, I think resources and reserves are so dispersed around the world that in the short term, a country might have an advantage in having all the mining operations already set up. But if they get perhaps too greedy with requests, then countries might try to push other countries that are abundant in reserves to start mining lithium.
So, do you think that there could ever be a OPEC for transition metals?
Yes, Howard, that's a great question, and there's actually a lot of discussions around it. I don't think there could realistically be one day. First of all, like I said, especially in the case of lithium, for instance, reserves are equally distributed around the world. So if some countries are excluded from the cartel, they could leverage their own mining sites. And then I think we often forget when we think about those metals that they're not really comparable to things like oil that are very standardized. Lithium is very much more of a specialty chemical. There's so many different specifications, types, grades, that it's very hard even to price it. When we think about lithium prices, superficially people might think of one price, but pricing is so complex that there's not a single price attributable to a thing such as lithium. So for this reason, I think creating a cartel might be tough because it might imply agreeing on so many things that might make the negotiations quite tough.
I suppose the flip side of the question that I just asked is more about protecting local environments, which I think is something that's really important as well in this context. Do you think there is scope for someone like the UN or another body to step in and provide guidelines of how metals mines can be run to protect local environment and also to protect local people?
Well, they could provide some environmental standards, I think, that people could follow in case they were to start developing mines. It would just be a bit difficult to enforce this. They would have to have the proper monitoring mechanism in place to make sure. And from a consumer side, people could just opt not to buy from these mines that are just like very dirty and very bad. So it's not just the UN or some governing body that could govern it. It could also be on us. The onus would be on us as well to make sure that we're procuring minerals or gadgets with using these minerals the right way.
Yeah, I suppose there could be like a green rainforest tick for a car produced with ethical cobalt or whatever it is. Interesting concept, and possibly something that we might see as things get going.
Yeah, but I must say I'm also quite pessimistic about it. You could argue that people could make the decision to reduce their oil consumption and oil associated product today, and yet here we are. And also, I think, especially in terms of mining sites, they might endanger rural communities a lot because those mines are often found in very rural areas, and so I think the consequences for rural communities are often overlooked.
Yeah, I think that's quite an important part. And I suppose I was talking about the environmental impacts, but the social impacts and sort of community impacts are massive as well. So it's a bit of a sober note to end on, but I am going to wrap up there. I suppose it's quite a serious topic that we've talked about. So thank you both very much for that conversation. It was very interesting to hear a deep dive into transition metals markets. Before I let you go, though, I do have to run you through the Greenomics gamble. So I have 3 statements about transitional metals, at least tangentially, 2 of which are true and 1 is false. So it's up to you to pick the lie. You're welcome to work together or spark some competition amongst colleagues. Good luck.
Good luck to us.
Good luck, man.
So the first statement is that the typical electric vehicle requires 6 times the mineral content of a conventional combustion engine vehicle. The second is that war was the first reason that the US drew up a list of critical minerals. It's so-called war minerals. The third is that cobalt comes out of the ground as a vivid blue rock. So what do you think?
I really
I
can't
think
get
the
this
first
wrong.
one is correct.
The first one is definitely
one is
correct.
correct, yeah.
Definitely correct, yeah.
Is cobalt blue? I know it's color for color. The name of color, that's bluish.
I don't think cobalt comes out of the ground like that. So I would go for the third one.
Yeah.
Consensus on the third one?
Yeah.
Well, you got it right. Well done. Well done. Yes, it comes out of the ground, boring old grey. So the cobalt color is blue, but it's a tint made using cobalt oxide and aluminium oxide. So the more you know. So with that, all that's left to do is say thank you very much to you both, Diego and Bea, for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you to the listeners for tuning into this episode. Next month, we'll be moving on to talk about the physical risks of climate change and how they might affect cities, populations, and our economy. To hear that episode, please subscribe on Spotify, SoundCloud, or on our website, and feel free to write to us at podcast@oxfordeconomics.com. That's it for today on Greenomics from Oxford Economics, where we know that money might make the world go round, but sustainability makes it a much nicer place to live. See you next time.